This reflection comes from Luke chapter 6, verses 27 to 38, a follow-on from last week's reflection where Jesus was talking to people about what life was all about. But here he's saying, love your enemies. It's a very challenging passage. It was to them then and it is to us today. He calls us to do good to those who hate us, pray for those who mistreat us. And this is very contrary to the natural human response, because the natural human response is retaliation. Now he gives a few examples. If someone slaps you on the cheek, then turn the other cheek. We have that saying today, to turn the other cheek, and it simply means don't retaliate. In those days, if you hit a person on the cheek with the back of your hand was the ultimate insult. And so what Jesus really is talking about here is not physical slapping, but insults. If someone insults you, he said, either just let them keep insulting you, or even, if you can do it, far better is to say something nice to them. And then we think about little kids today. It's a very natural thing to snap back. Little kids, if one kid calls another kid a name, then the other kid will come back with something even worse. That response seems to stay within us. We get a little bit more refined about it, but it's still there. We want to retaliate with insult. But next he says that if someone takes your coat, give him your shirt as well. Now that sounds a bit strange. In those days, if a person was poor and they owed something, then the person they owed it to could take their cloak as collateral. But in the law that was given to Moses, they weren't allowed to keep that cloak overnight, because that was all the poor person had to keep them warm. And what Jesus is saying, look, if you owe someone something, don't be sort of mean about it. Offer them your cloak and your shirt as well. Be generous. And then he said, if someone takes what belongs to you, don't demand it back. And again, he isn't necessarily referring to theft, but if you lend someone something and they don't repay you, then in the end, just let it go. If you lend them your lawnmower and they simply refuse to return it, well, it's better to keep good relationships than to demand that back and take them to court or whatever. It's talking about incredible generosity. Give without expecting anything back. This is a passage where we get what's often referred to as the golden rule. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Now this teaching was a bit shocking to the people in Jesus' time, and it is to us. It's very challenging to us. But it's nothing new. God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, and we know, you shall not steal, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder. Okay, most people say, well, I've never committed adultery, I've never stolen, I've never murdered anyone, so I'm keeping the commandments. But in Matthew 5, Jesus takes this a bit further and he says this. It says you shall not commit adultery, but if a man looks lustfully at a woman, he has committed adultery with her in his heart. In other words, it's not the action that matters, it's what's in the heart. That's what God sees. It's the same with murder. He says, it says you shall not murder. But if anyone is angry with his brother or calls him a fool, then he's just as guilty as the person who actually murders. So this is not new teaching of Jesus. God's laws are about living and loving the way God lives and loves us. We're called to love our enemies. Now that doesn't mean that we have to have warm, fuzzy feelings about them. But it does mean love is a verb. It means we have to do. We're to do good to those who hate us. We're to pray for them. We're to bless them. We're to treat them with respect. We're to help them whenever we can. And that is absolutely radical behaviour. And especially in our society today, where people take offence so easily. People are getting more and more intolerant. In verse 35 it says, God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. We're called to be merciful to all, just as God is merciful, because we ourselves are enemies of God when we disobey him, when we ignore him, when we do things our own way, when we're ungrateful for all that he's given us. We are his enemies, and yet he never stops loving us. He's always doing what is good for us. And he's asking us to do the same for others who are made in his image. To live this way is challenging in the extreme, but if we do, it can change the world. There's a story of President Reagan and Gorbachev, the Russian president, meeting to talk about disarming a nuclear disarmament. And the talks were going badly because neither side would trust the other. And apparently Reagan then said to Gorbachev, let's go off alone. So they did, with an interpreter. They went off, just the two of them. And Reagan said to Gorbachev, if the United States was attacked by aliens from outer space, would you come and defend us? And Gorbachev said, yes, of course we would. And Reagan said, and we'd do exactly the same for you. And that changed the whole meeting. From then on, they just saw each other quite differently, saw each other as human beings with needs. And the outcome of those talks were far more than anyone thought could ever be achieved. To see each other as fellow human beings with all the same needs, that's all that is needed. The great commandment is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. And the second one is this, love your neighbour as you love yourself. And that is a call to really radical living.
Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring your love. Where there is injury, your pardon, Lord. And where there's doubt, true faith in you. Oh, Master, grant that I may never sin. So much to be consoled as to to be understood as to understand, to be